Racing the Banner podcast, back at you. Already episode number 9er. Did I hear a 9er? That's a 9er. Here, for the 2024-2025 hockey season. And folks, I'll tell you what, we got a good one for you tonight. Great friend of mine, Mr. Matthew Pocket, is with us, a WXOU alum. And he is the voice of the Lake State Lakers Hockey Club and many other things up there. He's also a former WXOU radio personality. How many MABs you got? Like 45 or something like that? 62? I forget.
At one time I knew this. Now I don't. I think it's somewhere around 12 ballpark.
Okay.
Somewhere there.
All right. Fair enough.
You tripled what I had, I think. I mean, between Don and I, you definitely doubled what I had for sure. So I know I had like 4 or 5, but that's,
Which is still a lot. I mean, it's still like holy cripe, right?
Right.
You're going to hear a little you in me today, guys.
That's okay.
I mean, it's coming out.
That's right.
That's right. As we said before all this, we're just trolls. We're just trolls to you, my friend.
So,
hey, Lake State went on the road this weekend in CCHA play, beat Northern Michigan twice. So winner pasty dinner. So you boys are gonna hear some of the Oop come out in me here today. All right.
The real question is though, you didn't get any cat litter on your paws, did you? In those 2 beatdowns of Northern, did you?
I did not.
Okay,
I did not. I did not. But it was the beatdown at the Berry. Lake State. 5-time national champions, 3 times in the NCAA, twice in the NAIA days back in the 70s. It's a storied program. It's got one of the coolest stories in college hockey.
Sure.
We're the smallest Division I school to win a natty in any sport.
Yep.
It's the kind of thing that, I think when you look at the modern sports landscape and the injection of cash into so many of these departments, you look at the Big Ten, you look at the NCHC, you look at the SEC in so many sports, right? Not hockey, but in so many other sports. The injection of cash has turned college sports into this giant monster. And if you have that kind of financial clout, you have the ability to just attract so many recruits in multi-sports, to train them, to afford coaches, to afford infrastructure.
Yep.
It becomes self-perpetuating. I mean, you look at Ohio State, for example, they're one of the few programs in the country that actually makes money on athletics. I mean, that's not common, right? Schools are typically losing money on it. Now they tangentially gain because it's a good marketing tool. And it helps drive enrollment. It's a great way to appeal to your community and to the public, expand your profile. Dollar for dollar, I think it's one of the most efficient ways to promote your school. But the fact of the matter is, when you're looking at just income versus expenses, most schools lose money on athletics. And that gap has widened over the years. So for Lake State to go and dominate like it did, and then in 2021, the COVID year, what a shame that our great fans weren't even in the building with us for the most part. To get back to the NCAA tournament, it's the kind of story that I think in college sports we don't see much of anymore, and I think that's what's drawn me in large part to being here. This incredible story, and I think tremendous potential. We've had Damon Witten as our head coach for 11 years. Mike York is an assistant. Dwayne Rollison was on staff the last couple of years. We've got a couple of really good assistants now, young guys. TJ Goldstein out of Rochester, New York. Ryan Shelley out of Maine. He was with the Maine Nordiques in the Knoll for a while. Really good staff. And it's been a treat to tell these stories in one of the great hockey communities in North America. It really is, because you've got Sioux, Ontario right over the international bridge, and then when you get up into Houghton, a couple hours away but still here in the UP, Houghton's the birthplace of professional hockey. I mean, the first pro teams featured a lot of Canadian guys that came over into the United States because you had this kind of outlaw league taking place in the northern Keweenaw Peninsula of the UP. It's the birthplace of pro hockey in the world.
See, I didn't know that. I honestly didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, there was something. If I'm not mistaken, I think there was something back in the day where even like some of the original 6 teams, the Wings would go up there and play, and some of the inmates in Marquette and go up and play in Houghton, and there was something where they would do something like that. So to harken back to Matt's point, there was something I remember briefly
inmates?
about that.
Like they played they played the prisoners.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, no, that's pretty famous up here, and that's something that has taken place off and on throughout the decades, even. So
I did not
the
know
Wings
that.
actually used Pullard Stadium here in the Sioux as the home of their training camp for decades.
I knew that. Yeah, I knew about the Sioux part of it, but I didn't know they played like the inmate. Wow, that's
that's
hilarious.
I mean, that was probably back before you and I were even born, Don. But that was back, that was still back in the day. But I mean, that's honestly like that happened, and that's to harken back to his point, like that's a very it's a hockey rich part of the country, and you notice that, Matt, with all the programs and all the things and all those storied traditional programs hockey wise that are in that area. And I guess one of the questions I'll have kind of kicking this thing off is as we get started here, Matt, one of the things I'll mention is I know there was a great realignment roughly around 10 years or so ago. And for those who may not have paid attention, what's the outlook like? Where does Lake State play at? Like, where's their what conference are they in? What's changed over the last couple of years? Because I know that obviously the CCHA has kind of been rebirthed, revived. The CCHA that we all knew as kids, unfortunately, is no longer existing. But there was a second valiant attempt to try and restore it. So I guess just kind of bring people up to speed as to what's gone on, not only just with regards to Lake State, but just also the college hockey landscape.
Yeah, you saw a big realignment a few years ago. This goes back to 2013 is when primarily when the shift took place, and you saw it take place in a couple of different ways. You saw the birth of the Big Ten Hockey Conference. Mm-hmm. You also saw the birth of the NCHC, which was designed as a kind of power league. You also saw the Big Ten come around as a power league. I believe Miami was one of the programs that was they were a pretty big driving force behind the creation of the NCHC. So you had a few different conferences between 2010 and 2014 that kind of just never really had much of a chance to survive. And that's, I mean, look, that's just the reality of the college hockey landscape at this point anyway, right? Mm-hmm. College sports in general, right? Realignment. Everybody's trying to play a big game of musical chairs, and nobody wants to be left without a seat when the music stops. So you saw the creation of the NCHC and the Big Ten, and that took a very good league and a very historic league in the CCHA and killed it off. Central Collegiate Hockey Association was done, disbanding after the 12-13 season. You look at that league, it was a really, really fun league at that point too, because you had schools like Lake State, you had Ohio State, you had Bowling Green,
Miami of Ohio,
NMU, you had Western, Michigan State, Michigan, Notre Dame was in that league. I mean, it was a stacked league. Alaska was in there too. Mm-hmm. It was a really good league, but it goes the way of the dodo, and a lot of those teams either went NCHC or they went to the Big Ten, and the Big Ten just kind of kept to themselves. And everybody who didn't have a chair, so to speak, winds up in the WCHA, which was the other league that got raided as part of this big realignment. A lot of their teams wound up spinning off into the NCHC, the remainder go into the WCHA. That league continues for about 10 years, but geographically, there was a lot that didn't make sense with the WCHA. You had what would become the core of the new CCHA with Bemidji State, Minnesota State, Michigan Tech, Northern Michigan, Lake State, Ferris State, Bowling Green, but you also had Alabama Huntsville way down in the south. You've got two schools up in Alaska in Fairbanks and Anchorage. Mm-hmm. The geographic footprint was unreal. I mean, we were in the Summit back when we were all together at Oakland for our undergrad days, guys. and it had this crazy huge footprint spanning all the way across the Midwest, and you start to realize just how big the Midwest actually is. Now take that profile, add Alabama and Alaska to it. Right? And, those programs had different issues at different times regarding funding and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you have these
folded, right? I think UAH actually folded, correct?
Alabama Huntsville would fold. Yeah, they were. So after these 7 teams that went to form the CCHA, they announced they were going to leave. They were going to go off on their own. That left Alaska, Anchorage, and Huntsville to themselves. Huntsville did not survive. Anchorage almost did not. They were able to resume a program after, I think it was a year off, essentially.
Yep.
Fairbanks kept going, but they're now an independent, so is Anchorage, and you've now got the new CCHA that has added St. Thomas, who's departing in a couple of years, and then Augustana and Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is one of the best-kept sports secrets, I think, in the country right now. Sioux Falls is such a great sports city. Mm-hmm. It's got a great TV market, and you've got Augustana there right smack dab in the middle of the whole thing. So it's a great spot. You've got a USHL team there, too. Yep. You've got natural rivalries with some of those Minnesota teams, so you kind of got these clusters breaking out where you've got 3
obviously
teams
and then also too with North Dakota. I had an old coworker of mine who actually grew up near Grand Forks, and he went to school at Nodak, and would also say that it was fun to go watch, go down to Sioux Falls and go do all those things with Augustana and that.
Yeah. So now Nodak is one of those teams firmly embedded in the NCHC right now. And I think when you look at it, there's 3 real power conferences right now. There's Hockey East, there's the NCHC, and then there's the Big Ten.
Correct.
Now, the Big Ten hasn't really broken out in the way that people thought they would, right? I mean, you've clustered together some of these great teams in there.
And that's part of the problem, too.
Yeah, it hasn't quite clicked yet in terms of national success at this point. So they've got teams that are close every year. They just haven't quite broken through that Hockey East and NCHC
it's funny
dominance.
Because and to your point, the last season, the Big Ten put 4 teams into the tournament, which was the first time they had done that. Historically, they had gotten 3, but they had 4 last year. So maybe it's getting there. I don't know. I don't know if they'll put 4 in this year, to be honest with you. But,
well, when you look at the past champions going back to 2010, you've got Boston College, Duluth, Boston College, Yale, Union College, Providence, North Dakota, Denver, Duluth, COVID year, UMass, who we wound up playing in the opening round. Man, that team was so good under Greg Carvel that year. And, I mean, just such a loaded squad. I mean, you played them right. It's like, oh boy. But then Denver, Quinnipiac, and Denver again. So it's basically just Hockey East, NCHC, and then there's Union and Yale in there who look a little bit like, how the heck did they get there? In amongst all these other power schools, right? And
every year they're up in the
big
top
2
20
conferences for sure. So, but the CCHA, I think there's a ton of growth potential in this league, and now you're looking at, possible it's not possible anymore. CHL players are going to be able to come in, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out as far as potential recruiting goes going forward. I think a lot of people are still trying to figure that out in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And now, Matt, you brought up an interesting point, something Garrett and I have been talking about in nauseam over the last couple of weeks, and that is the CHL and the and the NCAA. I guess you could call it an agreement. But, you and I kind of had a conversation on Friday. I was more concerned that the CHL is going to have a hard time keeping up with itself with the players being allowed to come into allowed to go to the NCAA. And that's going to start next season. And you kind of had a different approach on that. You didn't think it's really going to hurt the CHL as much as perhaps I did.
Yeah, number one, good players find a place to play, and good players find good places to play. And the CHL has a great reputation for player development.
Right.
I don't think that changes, right? I mean, their coaches aren't going to suddenly flock en masse away from the leagues, the Dub, the QMJ, and the OHL. Their coaches know what they're doing.
Sure.
And for a lot of Canadian prospects, the dream is not go play for Michigan. It's not go play for Denver. It's not go play for UMass. The dream is to go play for major junior teams that they grew up watching in their communities, right? I mean, just like here in the American system, we have dreams of playing for some of these major universities, many of us ourselves. These kids are looking at their OHL program the same way, right? And as they move up through the ranks, they're thinking, what's the best development path for me? Now, this has been a one-way door for a long time where if you're a college hockey player, as long as you're still age eligible to move to CHL teams, you could do that. You could leave and just go, right? The door is closed going the other way, where guys in the CHL have essentially, with some rare exceptions, lost their NCAA eligibility. We had a guy who was here when I got here. I think he was a junior at that point, Braden Gelsinger, who played a little while in the WHL. Famously, Austin Swankler, who ended up at Bowling Green for a couple of years and then Michigan Tech for a season. Swankler was averaging a point per game for the Erie Otters in the OHL. I mean, it was kind of wild that he got cleared, and the NCAA even came out afterwards and was like, oops, yeah, that's a mistake on our part.
Right.
He actually wasn't eligible at all. But he was an American-born player who was looking at losing an entire season due to COVID and was like, I got to find something to do here. So he petitioned to the NCAA to be able to make the jump, and the NCAA, whatever their criteria were, mistakenly cleared him. But once they granted the clearance, it was kind of like what happened with Gelsinger, to my understanding, where once they clear you, they're not going to unclear you.
They're not going to unclear you, right.
They'll come out and say, oops, we goofed, we shouldn't have cleared you, but we're not going to undo it, whether or not the guy has even made it to campus yet at this point. It might be like 3 days later, but they're still going to say, listen, you're good. Just go do what you do. And Swankler, a couple of years ago, preseason player of the year in the CCHA. Kid could play. So, yeah, it's been a one-way door, and that's always kind of been the issue, especially in a modern world where you have NIL compensation. That's changed things, because the issue has been, some guys in the CHL have signed pro contracts, so they're receiving stipends from their professional clubs, for example, and the NCAA looks at that and goes, that doesn't fit under the definition of being an amateur athlete, so we're just going to bar the whole league at that point.
Right.
In a modern, I think if you go back a ways, that makes a lot more sense, right? Because compensation was a lot more strict.
Sure.
Now with the slackening of things under NIL, now the schools still can't provide compensation to the athletes. It's these NIL collectives. The school can't go, listen, we're going to cut you a check for $10,000. It doesn't work like that. School can't do that.
Correct.
So, I think there's still going to be, in terms of, okay, what does the compensation look like? Where's it coming from, kind of thing. I think you still might have some situations where some guys might not be eligible depending on kind of their own individual path. But by and large, for most CHL players that have not signed a pro deal at this point, I mean, they're going to be eligible. So now it's a two-way door. In terms of the CHL not being able to compete, I'm not worried about that for them at all. I think, when you look at top guys, right, great examples here, a couple of Canadian-born guys, Connor Bedard, Adam Fantilli. Connor Bedard winds up going to the WHL, and he rips it up for Regina for a couple of years, and, just kills everything.
Ripping it up is a good way of putting it.
Kills, eats whatever he wants, whenever he wants to, right?
Yes.
I mean, he was the alpha predator in that league for a couple of seasons.
Absolutely.
Then you've got an Adam Fantilli who goes a completely different route. Fantilli goes to the USHL, and he decides to go the college route. Now he's a one and done at Michigan, He didn't stick around. He didn't go get his degree. Neither did a guy like Artie Levshinov, who signed with the Blackhawks after a year at Michigan State. Maybe the CHL would have been a better path, but I think for them, they're looking at it like, they're talking to their advisor and they're going, "What's the best path for me? Mm-hmm. Who wants me? And who's going to give me the best development route to become the best player that I can, to be able to go on to the pros and have a long, productive, successful career?" And those are conversations taking place with their advisors from long before they ever make it to their respective programs, right? Bedard's advisor is sitting there going, "Do I really think that college is the best route for this kid?" And the answer is not really. Fantilli's advisor is thinking, though, well, I can get this guy to Michigan. Is that the best development route for him? Heck yeah, it is. So he winds up at Michigan. So good players find good places to play. Good players find good coaches. And sure, you end up with programs that'll rise and fall over time, but by and large, good players will find good places to play under good coaches that will give them good development opportunities. And the CHL, that's not going to go anywhere. That's not changing.
Yeah.
They'll still attract plenty of good players, and I don't think that most of their guys are necessarily unhappy with where they're at, right? I think, talking to a couple of different people, I think the worry has been, well, CHL guys are now just going to flood over to the NCAA. I don't think it's going to be nearly as much as people think it will. I think you'll see a little burst here once it gets opened up in the next year. And then I think you'll see it level off a little bit. Because I think those guys like where they're at by and large.
Well, Matt, you would also mention, too, that you can't – there's some players in Canada, because Canada's high school side of things allows them to have a 13th year. So without having the high school diploma, that makes them NCAA uneligible. So they wouldn't be able to make that jump. For the moment.
Yeah, maybe for the moment, right? Because the weird thing is that hockey as a college sport is non-congruent with the high school system, whereas like football and basketball, what a lot of people are used to, they're congruent with ages. So you finish high school at age 18, give or take a little bit, and then you go right into the college ranks. That's not necessarily true. You'll see guys get stashed in juniors until they're overagers, and they come into their college hockey teams at 20.
Right.
So that's the end of your junior eligibility. That's the end of your major junior eligibility, too. What you could end up seeing, though, some of the younger guys might not be academically eligible. Remember, this isn't going to affect 16 and 17-year-olds because they would still be juniors and seniors in high school at this point.
Right on.
So they're not going to move to college hockey one way or another anyway. It's not going to happen. When you start getting into the 18, 19, 20-year-olds, okay, are some of them taking that 13th year? Okay, well, that would rule them out because they don't have their high school diploma at this point, right, or an equivalent. Are these guys' grades up to snuff? Some of these guys might not even get admitted to the particular school that they want to get to.
Yeah, right.
Grades have not been a priority for them.
Especially with a lot of those private East Coast. With a lot of those private East Coast schools, too, for sure.
Oh, yeah, and the CHL runs a pro-style schedule. That's a big difference, too.
Absolutely.
So, it's advantageous to a lot of guys, I think, to take that 13th year rather than try to cram it all in while you're trying to run a pro-style schedule. So, are those guys going to be eligible? And then from there, you get through who's eligible, and then you go, who wants to? And that's, again, going to be a narrowing of the list because a lot of these guys like being CHL players. They think it's the best path for them. Where I think you might see the most impact is guys who age out of juniors. They get through that age 20 season, and now they're going, okay, what next? The CHL has provided money to players so that they can go and pursue college degrees after they're done with their CHL eligibility. Now, I don't know what that would look like going to a U.S. university as opposed to going to a Canadian university.
Right.
That might be something that has to get figured out still.
Right.
there's a lot of pieces that still need to get worked through. What we have are the broad strokes right now. We don't have the details of exactly how this system works. Is there something that goes back to the CHL team if the guy, decides, hey, I'm leaving, right? They could always trade the rights around for a guy who had gone college. Fantilli got traded by Saginaw after he got selected in the OHL priority selection. They traded his rights, and he wound up never using it to go to the CHL, for example, but he was still CHL eligible, right? I think you're going to see the most movement in guys who are overagers, who would be coming to the end of their junior A eligibility anyway. You're not really messing around with the OHL team because OHL team can't keep them after this year anyway, or the WHL team or the QMJ team.
Right.
Kind of like with junior A, at that point, in terms of the technicalities, it just becomes an extension of junior A at that point. I think that might be where you see the most movement. Guys who have been in the CHL and are aging out that now decide, I don't know if I'm ready to sign a pro deal, or I don't know if I really want to sign a pro deal at this point. Like, maybe that's not what I'm looking for. This college route doesn't sound too bad. I think that's where you're going to see the most movement with this.
And I think
go ahead, Garrett.
Well, I was going to also mention something too, Matt. I think and to expand upon your point, I was also listening. I forget who it was, but I was listening to NHL Network Radio. They were discussing this, and I think they had also said that U Sports and then even like the AJHL, some of those junior leagues in Canada may feel the most impact, especially getting those overagers, like you mentioned, because now they don't go to those go to those universities in Canada. Now there's a broader playing field there. But I think the one thing in my head that has still stuck out about this, right, because clearly there will be a need for people to want to play college hockey. Now, I don't know how expansive it'll be, but nonetheless, there will still be some sort of expansion. And I think we've seen that now in obviously the revenue generating sports now where, the media coverage is big. Everything is just trying to get how many eyeballs can we get on this? You're seeing, this great realignment in all these sports. And I'm wondering, Matt, with hockey, you're seeing some of these programs, like, for example, let's say in Oregon or UCLA, who just joined the Big Ten, that have ACHA teams, and Indiana, who has like an ACHA team, that hypothetically, if let's say there is enough interest there, I wonder if these conferences would, push ahead a way for them to expand, right? Maybe an Indiana does join the Big Ten and get a D1 program. Maybe an Oregon does get a D1 hockey program. And then you expand the landscape of everything where then now you have that bigger footprint in the United States.
Yeah, I could see the Big Ten in particular trying to push for that. And real quick, for those who aren't familiar with what we mean when we say ACHA, right? The moniker has been club hockey for a long time. I don't like that. They don't like that either. Self-funded is a far more accurate term. Club sounds like it's this unorganized rabble of disorganized, chaotic entities that go out there and play with their sticks for funsies. That's not at all what the ACHA is. No. The ACHA is a governing body in the same way that the NCAA is. It's an oversight body. They run a full competitive schedule for, I think it's something like 200 plus teams now across the country, across men's and women's sports in multiple divisions. Now, it's hockey-centric, right? Unlike the NCAA, which oversees all sports, the ACHA is purely hockey. So it is college hockey, and schools do look to bring players in to fill out their hockey teams on campus. You go wear the sweater of your university. Now, it's not NCAA Division I, it's not NCAA Division III, but these are fully functioning schools, school programs that compete against each other. They're authorized by the school. Now, again, the difference being they have to go look for their own money, so they don't have the resources. You tend to see much more regional footprints when it comes to their recruiting. They're going to go get a lot more local guys and that kind of thing, guys and gals. But I think the biggest thing behind ACHA, to me, is it's a viable alternative for people who don't necessarily want the rigors of the NCAA, and that's a tough schedule. It really is. Or people who maybe, they're good enough to go play somewhere. There's a lot of good hockey players out there who can contribute something to a team, but an NCAA school isn't looking at you for whatever reason, right? There are options for you to continue on, just like with junior hockey being such a broad landscape. There's places you can go play. There's high school routes, right? This is an alternative to that. Now, your top prospects are obviously always going to go, CHL. They're going to go NCAA Division I. Or they're going to be in Europe, staying as part of those academy systems.
Right.
But ACHA is a legitimate functioning league. It's not this club hockey moniker where it just sounds like, wow, this is intramurals with a logo. It's not that at all. I would compare it to the NAIA, right?
Okay.
You're talking about a different level of funding and a different level of sport here, which means you're probably not going to get the top athletes. But in terms of the structure of the organization, yeah, it's a legit, viable organization. So I think, Garrett, kind of coming back to your point in terms of different programs further on the path, stocking guys up, I don't think we sometimes realize how many players are out there and how many junior teams are out there, for example.
Yeah.
There's like a billion of them.
Yeah.
And one of the things that people in the game have talked about is, are there too many junior teams? Are there way too many options for junior teams? And there's 100 million of these things out there. And maybe it does dilute the product a little bit sometimes because, you think about it, you go over in Europe, pretty much every pro team is running its own academy system.
Right.
You look here, you've got the NAL, you've got the USHL. Those are the big two, but you've also got your AAA options. You've got your USPHL and your NA3HL. And there are just so many different avenues for players to go that when you're talking about funding, funneling players into the next step, oftentimes there's fewer teams at that next step than what you had at this step. So there's going to be a narrowing down anyway, right? Again, I think when you're talking about, quote unquote, good players, however you want to define that, right? That's a loose term and not a specific thing necessarily, but good players will find a place to play. Good players will find good coaches at good programs with good levels of competition that are better for their development. And I think it's good to have plenty of viable opportunities for other players, too, who are not going to the show as a top overall pick, right?
Right.
Bro, I'm the next Bedard. Bro, no, you're not.
Right, right, yeah.
But there's still great places for you to go wherever you fit in the hockey world. So I'm not worried necessarily about things like U Sports getting drained out of talent. I think they'll be fine. I think players find places to play, coaches find good players, and players find good programs.
Yeah, and to your point there about players finding good places to go and being the next Bedard and whatever. You only have Bedards and McDavids once every, I think the average is 6-7 years in a junior level. Yeah. And that's just how it is. Lafreniere, I guess maybe you could say that. However, I do think he was a little overpriced coming out of junior, but that's that's for another day. But still, you're right. There's only a couple of those generational players that come out of that. For the most part, everybody I think is pretty even pretty much when they come up to junior level.
And I think with those super freaks that I call them, right? Their paths are being monitored from much younger than most.
Correct.
Right?
Right on. Right.
And they've got advisors with them whose industry is to help guide their paths. So when a Bedard ends up going to the CHL, the OHL specifically, that's not some happy accident. Oh, got that right. Just like Fantilli ending up at Michigan, right? I mean, they're not just going, we didn't know the CHL was around, right? No, they're like, this is the place that we want him to go, right? We want him here. He wants to go here because he thinks that this is the coaching staff and this is the program and this is the level of competition. And they both offer something different, right? I mean, I think when you look at, I'm in Sioux, Michigan, so the Sioux Greyhounds in the OHL are right across the river. Our radio stations are actually partners with the Sioux Greyhounds and Lake Superior State.
Right.
Laker games run on 99.5 Yes FM, yesfm.net. The Greyhounds run on rock101.net. The Sioux Rock Station, Rock 101. There's been a good relationship between these two teams. They like each other. They like helping each other out. They're actually starting to promote content on each other's broadcasts and in each other's arenas too. So I think there's a really good, healthy relationship there. I think the CHL, it's very much a known quantity, right? And I think when you look at it, you get guys coming up sometimes at 16 years old and 17 years old, and then they'll contribute for 3-4 years in the OHL, and they'll be good players, right?
Right.
Is college hockey necessarily the route that they want to go that's best for them? Oh, maybe not, right? There's a lot of development that takes place between – if you look at the development year over year from ages like 14 to 18, it's wild.
Yeah.
And when you look again at, say, 18 to 21, it's wild. 22 to 25. Sometimes you're seeing guys just jump up in physical maturation.
Right.
I was talking to our team captain the other day, Grant Heineman, who, when he was a freshman, he came in as a true freshman, which is not wholly usual for our program, right? But, he was a guy who was physically ready and matured a bit early. If you look at him, just, my God, that young man is built, right? He was 18 when he came in, and he was sitting in a locker next to 24-year-old Mitch Oliver. That's a grown dude right there, right? That's a dude. That's a man. That's not a youth hockey player at this point, right? So if you're talking about, the development tracks, that's one of the things that go into the CHL can be really good for. I'm playing against guys within a certain age group that physically probably aren't 25-year-old grown dudes who can pick me up and throw me around, right?
Right on.
And now in 3 years, I'm probably going to be able to do that. But right now, probably not. So I'm probably going to be used like a heavy bag and thrown around and smashed up quite a bit sometimes. Again, you get – that's not universal, right? Which is why it's nice that you have these multiple development paths, and a good advisor is going to help guide you along those paths. They're going to see what the best options are for you. A guy like Fantilli was very ready to go play in the Big Ten and against CCHA teams. And by the way, a lot of CCHA teams tend to be a little bit older. Fantilli was just fine. We saw him play up at Lake State a couple of years ago, and it was just like, can we never do this again? I don't like playing this guy. He's good.
Yeah.
He's really good, and he can handle the physicality. A lot of 17-year-olds in the world can't do that yet.
And that's the thing,
why
Matt,
you have different development stages.
Absolutely, and that's the one thing we try to talk about here in our pod with, like, I'll use Lucas Raymond as a perfect example of that, where he played over in the Swedish league for 2 or 3 years before he came over. That is a man's league, and as an 18-year-old, if you can handle the man's league, you can go to the NHL, and you saw it immediately, right? Same with Mo Snyder.
Yeah.
Man's league.
Yeah.
Right over. Edmonton, same thing, man's league.
Dell is a good league.
Right.
Dell is a really strong league that people,
100%.
I think, have overlooked a little bit, but there's a lot of good players who've gone to Dell.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think there's something to that, and perhaps maybe that's something that between the CHL and maybe NCAA, that's something they can bridge the gap. So instead of having someone have to go over to Sweden to play for 2 years, maybe perhaps they stay local, if you will, and kind of ride the roller coaster up to the NHL. They're going to come in at the same age anyway, so maybe the partnership.
Well, what I think is interesting too, when you look at the ramps in terms of eligibility after your draft year, right? You get drafted, and then wherever you are starts a certain clock, which means there's a window that NHL team has to go sign you.
Absolutely.
If you're in juniors still, that window is a certain amount. If you're in Europe, it's a different amount. Now, if you then, we had a guy for a couple of years, Arvid Henriksen, and Arv had one of the longest clocks I've ever seen. He was a 98 birth year. He was picked in the 7th round by Montreal out of the AIK program. Arv had his clock start. It was 2016, so he stayed with AIK in the 2016-17 season, and even he made his U19 debut that year. He played 2 games for the senior club. You can do that when you're still a student and not burn through your eligibility.
Correct. Yeah.
For the college program. So he spent 2 more years in Sweden. He moved to Örebro and played with them for a little bit in their J20 league. Then he came over here and signed with Des Moines in the USHL and played 10 games with the Austin Bruins in the NAHL. So that starts his clock again on a completely different timer. And then he commits to Lake Superior State. Guess what that means?
Starts over again.
His clock restarts again on the college timer. So he was finally in 2022-23. He was a 16 draft pick, by the way, right? In 22-23, at the end of the season, we are in the CCHA playoffs. We're getting ready for, was it Minnesota State? I know we were at one of the Minnesota schools, or was it it might have been St. Thomas. I can't remember. Anyway, it all blurs together after a while sometimes. But we were in Minnesota. I remember that. We were in Minnesota playing in the first round of the CCHA tournament, and it's ahead of like game 2, and suddenly Twitter starts blowing up that Arvid Henriksen has been dealt by Montreal in the Nick Bonino trade to the San Jose Sharks. And our first thought was, it's been so long, how do they still have his rights? 2, why are you trading him in the middle of his playoffs? I mean, yeah, that's great for his state of mind as he's got a big game to prepare for. Wow, that's awesome. Thanks, guys.
Well, that's in the beginning of March, right?
In the A.
That's in the beginning. That's in the beginning of March, right? For your guys' playoffs.
Yeah.
Well, that ends up being the hockey trade deadline, though, so that kind of coincides with, I mean, it's not fair, but
pro side,
the pro side, right, the pro side, right.
So, but we're sitting there just like, wow, that's great for him, isn't it? Gee, golly, thanks, boys. Thanks for the heads up. And I don't think he had any idea it was coming either. He found out and he was like, huh?
They still remember me?
So they wound up moving him to San Jose. He wound up playing 1 game with the Barracuda that year in the AHL, and now he's back home in Sweden. So,
crazy.
But when you talk about the clocks, right? I mean, he played 4 years for us at Lake Superior. He was a good defenseman. Guy was big, 6'5", could skate well, he used his reach well. He was a guy, great teammate too. Guy that we all loved having around. But he had one of the longest clocks that we'd ever seen. Here it is, 7 years after he's drafted, and Montreal still retains his draft rights. It's like, okay, that doesn't happen very often. So again, the question then becomes, for all of these players, whether you're drafted or not, what's the best route for your development?
Right.
So I think this idea that, the CHL is just going to go get plundered, and no, I don't think so. A lot of those guys like being there. Mm-hmm. I think it'll be a great opportunity for guys who are done with their CHL eligibility. And I do think you'll see some guys who, they get into the CHL, and they're 16, 17 years old, or maybe even 18, and then they're looking at it like, maybe this isn't the route that I want to be in, right? Maybe I developed on a different track than we thought I was going to, and now I'd be better off throwing around a bunch of 23-year-old grown dudes, right? I mean, that's
that's an interesting take on that. That's actually an interesting take, because not all the popcorn kernels pop at the same time, right? So that's interesting, and that's a different take on it, and that's why I enjoyed your take on this the other day, because I was doom and gloom. I was like, oh, that's gonna be the end of the CHL. There goes Brandon Wheat Kings. Yeah. There goes whatever.
Don was like having a full on like TED talk to me. Like,
yeah, no, I had a meltdown. I needed like wine. Yeah, it was weird, but but yeah, I was freaked out. I'm like, man. I was like, I can't believe the CHL is going to go away. In the back of my mind, I'm just like, the NCAA is going to eat their shit for breakfast. I was like, it's going to be nothing. It's like, this is going to be easy. And
I just wish when I was playing that I'd be as good as Gavin McKenna right now. By the way, that's another super freak, Matt. That kid on Medicine Hat, that kid's going to be special. I don't know if you've seen it, Don. 19 games, he's already got 39
points. I saw that.
Dude is 17 years old, and he's putting up double-digit point per game. Just going out here casually, just, making the league his,
And that's what you get, though.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing, right? Like we talked about. I mean, great players will find programs that are good for them. And by the way, something that you have in the CHL, if you're on a program and you're sitting there like, I think my coach is a knucklehead, I need to get out of here, you can force a trade.
That's also true.
If you're in college hockey, you're stuck for the year, right?
Unless
you started the year with this team, you ain't going nowhere. There's no winter transfer window. They don't do trades, right?
Nope.
Which, to be honest, I'm glad that doesn't exist in the school environment. I was talking to our equipment guy who was with Rockford over the last couple of years, and Alex was telling me just it's the worst thing in the world when you're with these guys and you get to know them and you're close to them, and then they get traded.
Yeah,
it's the worst thing in the universe. Like, I got to pack your stuff and get you on a plane in 20 minutes. And then you got to figure out your house a couple days later. And then and all this while trying to play pro hockey,
But then they got to coordinate everything else too on top of that, right? Like the accommodations there, they got to get the taxi there, they got to learn the new systems, the playbook, all that stuff, and that's something that none of us. That's the human side of, I guess, the ugly reality of what major, junior, and AHL and all that might be. Not that it matters in the end of the day, because some of them are conditioned to do it, but it still is just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I think The Athletic did a really good piece a couple of years ago too, talking about that human side of it. And in my broadcasting, I think that's probably the single most important thing that I can do. Try to tell human stories about these guys that are competing for these teams, right?
Sure,
these
absolutely.
are people. And basketball, I think, as a sport, and baseball, I think, as a sport, they've done pretty well being able to humanize a lot of their guys. And there's a simple reason for it. To me, because you can see them.
Yeah.
You can get floor seats at the Knicks game, and you can slap hands with whoever they're coming down the court after they bang in a three, right? With baseball, their guys are pretty accessible, standing out there in the field. And in hockey and football, they're literally wearing suits of armor.
Right.
They have helmets that obscure their faces, oftentimes. And in hockey's case, you have a literal glass shield around the rink that prevents that kind of close contact. So I think it's easy for us to lose sight of that these are people, because we're essentially seeing them dress up like medieval knights so that they don't break every bone in their body in 5 minutes of competition, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's a physical necessity of what we do in this game, and football has that going on too. and this is just a theory. I've never read any scientific studies about this, about the impact of marketing and that kind of thing. But, I do think it does get a little dehumanizing sometimes when you can't interact with somebody. You can't slap hands with McDavid after he scores, right? You will always have a pane of glass between you and him. So they have to market players in different ways in order to try to make that connection. Part of what I try to do as a broadcaster is build that bridge between the audience and the team so that you see these guys for who they are. They are human beings. Let's share these journeys together. I think in college you tend to get a lot more stability.
Yep.
Because, hey, I've got a scholarship commitment, and the school can't pull that unless I go on a drunken rampage and crash my car through 5 buildings and sink 3 ships at sea. Right.
Well,
I mean,
yeah. And to your point there, yeah, I know you can't trade in the college level. However, a player can decide that they want to jump into the portal and they want to use that opportunity. And you and I talked in length about this on Friday, but the portal isn't this I'll say like a subway station where you're just going to go down there and you're going to travel to the next city. It's not quite that way. And you had mentioned that it's a database, but it's not the same for everybody in a way, based on what the player might be.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a misnomer when we talk about the portal.
Right.
The portal has become a catch-all in a lot of ways for a lot of changes taking place all at the same time.
Right.
I think what stands out to me, number one, the biggest change was you got rid of the mandatory wait period.
Correct. Yep.
Before, when you decided to transfer, you had, and so here was the mechanic. When you needed to transfer, you would go contact your coach and tell your coach, I want to leave. The coach could set some terms and conditions on you leaving, like you can't go in conference, right? I won't allow that. Or you can't stay in state. You have to go. I'm not risking playing against you again, and then you beat me, which I think can get a little overblown sometimes, right?
Right. Yep.
There's been some incidents that wound up being high profile. There was a tight end, I believe, at Maryland who wanted to go play for Michigan State because he wanted to be closer to his sick mother or something like that. And his coach was like, well, you can't go to the Big Ten. And so he wound up going to like Central Michigan for a year, which, fine for Central. But that's still 3 hours away from his sick mother. Whereas if he'd been at Michigan State, he'd have been like down the road, right? I mean, I don't remember all the logistics of it, but it would have been significantly easier on the entire family to have him at Michigan State. And the coach is just like, don't care, can't go. Right?
Do you think Matt, do you think that's part of just the pettiness of the sport? Like, I feel like with the wall dropping now between making this, as you've called it, the 2A door between the CHL and the NCAA, kind of there was that old gentleman's agreement, and if you will, that made it that one-way door in the first place. And am I wrong in thinking that kind of is that wall's coming down? I mean, it's like Reagan talking to Gorbachev, telling him to drop the damn wall.
I don't know. I mean, I think, there was a guy who played for Lake State a couple of years ago who wound up leaving midway through the season and signed with the Erie Otters, and that was part of them. I think it was their 7th D as they try to make a run to the Memorial Cup. So, and that's the thing, right? I mean, there were various gentlemen's agreements in place depending on kind of who you talk to.
Right.
Let's take the commit process. Let's come back to transfers here in a second, but the commitment process, right? First thing is, you're talking to a recruit, and the recruit likes what you got to say, and the recruit gives a verbal. The verbal commitment was essentially an announcement. Nowadays it's a nice excuse to post a pretty cool looking Twitter graphic. Sorry, X. Force of habit. It's a chance for you to post a nice little social media graphic saying committed, right, with your signature on there. But that was essentially, for a long time, a hands-off, get away from him to every other team in your chosen sport, right? Football, volleyball, basketball,
right?
Swim and dive, hockey, right? It was essentially a go away, right? He's ours. Right. Now, the kid could still decommit at that point. But, there was nothing official on paper, but it was, okay, like, he's ours. Go away.
Right. We're dating now, right? Well, you can't
right.
date him, right? Yeah.
The official came into play with the national letter of intent, and that was a protection now for the school. It's essentially a 1-year contract that you sign as a player that says for the upcoming blank school year, right? In this case, it would be the 2025-26 season. I've committed to play for school X in sport Y. So that was a protection, too, for a long time. It's tamper city now, though. I mean, everybody knows. Kids are getting tampered with all the time. I mean, advisors, it's blatantly against the rules, but there's a lot of advisors who will go like, all right, well, the kid signed, but he just got a call because he blew up at this tournament, this showcase, and now he's getting calls from such and such, and he really wants to go there. So can you let him out of the NLI? And oftentimes what you'll see in hockey in particular is, no, we're not letting him out of the NLI, but he still has a year of junior eligibility. Fine, he can stay in juniors this year because we're not letting him out of the NLI so that he can go somewhere else and cook us, right? But the following year, 26-27, he doesn't have a commitment for that. He's signed to go to this program at this date. He can just choose not to enroll and then stay in his junior program so you can stash him. That's tougher in other sports that are congruent with high school where the date the kid is coming in. Now, you get some reclassifications. That does happen, but it's not super common. It's not unheard of. It's not rare. It's just not an everyday thing. But essentially, you're pushing back your commit date. You see it a little bit more in basketball, for example, where a guy will push back his year essentially, so he's coming in as class of 2026 instead of class of 2025, right? That kind of thing. So the NLI has even been eroded because there's just so much backroom chatter going on.
Right.
And it's amazing when you look at the number of guys that commit and sign their NLIs that then never actually play a game for that team because they're still getting contacted left, right, and center by somebody or another, officially or otherwise, and now there's issues in there. Now, what you end up seeing in other sports is first-year transfers, right? I'm going to go ball out for this team. I'm going to go show out. I'm going to have a great year, and then I'm going to stick my name in the portal, and I'm going to leave, right? And for the schools, they're sitting there just like, oh, boy, right? Now, with juniors, though, with junior eligibility, that changes a little bit where you can just send a guy right back. Hey, all right, you don't want to come here? Fine, we don't want you here. Bye, right? So the recruitment process has changed quite a bit because of some of those gentlemen's agreements that have been left by the wayside, and that's just within college athletics. Now, let's come back to the transfer portal because the transfer portal is another important part of this whole thing. You saw a lot of change in a very short amount of time. Number one, when you transferred from a school, you used to have to sit out a year. Now that's gone, right? That doesn't exist anymore. In fact, there was a recent court case that the NCAA lost where they changed the rules so that your first transfer was free, right? First time free. And your second transfer meant that you had to sit out a year. That's no longer the case either.
Right. Yep.
So you can transfer theoretically as many times as you want. Now somebody has to take you, and theoretically they're committing scholarship resources for as long as you have eligibility. If they don't think that you're going to be here for that, maybe they think twice about giving it to you in the first place, right? Because you're trying to project stuff out. and you've slotted, say, 4 or 5 spots for right shot D in set 4 or 5 year window. Well, now, okay, maybe we go grab this guy out of the portal. Does that bump somebody out? Does that bump one of our spots? What happens if we bump one of the spots and the guy transfers again?
Right.
Now we have to go find a new one, and the guy that we were probably looking at probably has no interest in us anymore because we weren't interested in dealing with him because this other guy came up. So the portal opens up all kinds of weird windows because you can transfer as many times as you want. There then comes the questions of academics, right? Will you get admitted? Are your grades good enough to get into the school that you're trying to transfer to? Do your credits transfer? Anybody who's ever transferred from community college or from one university to the next,
right.
Good gravy.
Right.
Transferring your credits sucks.
And it's not a guarantee. And it's not a guarantee.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
So you go into the portal, and you may not necessarily know anything about where you're trying to. And maybe you're like, okay, I'm going to go to, I'm going to go to one of these couple of schools. I got my short list, right? And that's great. I mean, maybe the system fits and the coach is right. And then you go apply, and they're like, well, you would be in your junior year, but you're actually like a first semester sophomore in terms of your credits that transfer. So you'll have to not only go through the next 2 years with our program, you'll either have to take a heavy class load or kick your graduation down the line by a year or so that you can finish up all your coursework with stuff you may have already taken in some form or another. So you end up with some guys who get into the portal and they're thinking, I'm going to go hither and yon. And then they go, uh-oh. Now, this is also a key thing behind the portal. When you go into the portal, the school is no longer required to honor their scholarship commitment to you. If you go back to the school that you're at, that's the school's choice, not yours. Now, you can enroll as a student. They just have no obligation to stick with the original agreement of your scholarship. So, maybe you were on a, 40% scholarship or something like that, but you go into the portal, it doesn't work out, and a month later you're like, Coach, can I come back? And the coach is just like, no.